The security camera footage didn't lie. At 3:47 p.m. on a humid Tuesday afternoon, outside Morrison's hardware store on Maple Street, 28-year-old Brandon Kellerman, heir to the Kellerman commercial real estate empire, shoved 73-year-old Korean War veteran Henry Cho so violently that the elderly man crashed into a newspaper stand, shattering his hip and fracturing 2 ribs. The reason: Henry's 1987 Buick had taken too long to pull out of a parking space Brandon wanted. Henry Cho wasn't just any senior citizen. He was a decorated combat medic who had saved 17 lives during the Battle of Pork Chop Hill. For 40 years after the war, he'd owned Cho's Diner downtown, a beloved establishment where he'd fed 3 generations of families, often giving free meals to those who couldn't pay. Every Veterans Day, the mayor personally thanked him at the town square ceremony. Witnesses said Brandon had honked repeatedly, screamed profanities through his Mercedes window, then jumped out and confronted Henry as the old man slowly exited his vehicle with his cane. "You senile old bastard! People like you shouldn't be allowed to drive," Brandon had shouted, according to testimony from 4 bystanders. When Henry calmly replied, "Young man, patience is a virtue," Brandon had exploded. The shove sent Henry backward into the metal stand. The sickening crack of bone was heard by everyone nearby. As Henry lay groaning on the pavement, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, Brandon had simply gotten back in his Mercedes. "My lawyers will handle this," he'd said to the gathering crowd before driving away. But Brandon Kellerman had miscalculated badly. Someone had filmed everything. By that evening, the video had 2.3 million views. By the next morning, it was on every national news network. The hashtag Justice for Henry was trending. Veterans organizations across the country demanded prosecution. The district attorney, facing unprecedented public pressure, filed charges within 48 hours. Aggravated assault, assault on an elderly person, and reckless endangerment. Brandon's family attempted damage control. His father, Police Commissioner Robert Kellerman, a man whose name carried weight in every courthouse and precinct in the state, released a carefully worded statement expressing concern and promising that all facts would come to light. The Kellerman legal team, led by the notorious defense attorney Martin Schaefer, filed motions to suppress evidence, questioned witness credibility, and leaked stories suggesting Henry had antagonized Brandon first. None of it worked. The public outcry only grew louder. Henry spent 3 weeks in the hospital. His hip required surgery and a titanium replacement. Doctors said he'd never walk without assistance again. His diner, already struggling, closed permanently. Henry couldn't manage it from a wheelchair. The preliminary hearing was a circus. Reporters packed the courthouse steps. Protesters held signs, "No wealth can buy justice," and "Heroes deserve respect." Inside, Brandon pled not guilty with a smirk on his face. The trial date was set for 6 weeks later. Judge Patricia Morrison, known for her no-nonsense approach to law, would preside. Or so everyone thought. 3 days before trial, Judge Morrison recused herself. Her son had eaten at Cho's Diner growing up, creating a potential conflict of interest. The case was randomly reassigned. When the clerk read the new name, journalists scrambled to update their notes, lawyers exchanged nervous glances, and the Kellerman family went pale. The Honorable Clarence Thomas, not the Supreme Court Justice, but a federal district court judge who shared the name and reputation for unwavering principle, would now hear the case. Judge Thomas was a legend. A former Marine Corps officer, former prosecutor, and a jurist who had once sentenced his own nephew to prison for embezzlement without hesitation. His courtroom was known as the place where privilege died and truth prevailed. Brandon's attorney immediately filed for another recusal. Denied. The trial would proceed. On the morning of the first day, as journalists set up outside the courthouse and protesters chanted, Henry Cho sat in his wheelchair in the witness preparation room, holding the Purple Heart he'd received 50 years earlier. His daughter squeezed his hand. "Justice will come, Dad." Henry nodded slowly, but his eyes held doubt. He'd seen wealthy men escape consequences before. In the defense conference room 3 floors up, Brandon Kellerman laughed at something his attorney said, checked his Rolex, and texted his girlfriend about dinner plans after this circus. He had no idea what was coming. But an unexpected revelation was about to change everything in the courtroom. Courtroom 6B was packed beyond capacity. Every wooden bench held shoulder-to-shoulder spectators, veterans in their military caps, local business owners, reporters with notebooks, and ordinary citizens who'd taken the day off work to witness what they hoped would be accountability. The bailiffs had turned away at least 100 more people at the doors. The air conditioning struggled against the August heat and the press of bodies. Tension hung thick as smoke. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff stood. All rise for the Honorable Judge Clarence Thomas. The room erupted in the sound of shuffling feet and scraping chairs. Judge Thomas entered through the side door, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his late 60s, his gray hair cropped military short, his black robes crisp and immaculate. His face was carved granite, his dark eyes sharp and measuring. He'd seen combat in Vietnam, prosecuted mob bosses, and presided over hundreds of trials. Nothing rattled him. He took his seat with deliberate calm, surveyed the courtroom with a single sweeping glance that silenced even the whispers, and spoke in a voice that carried natural authority. "Be seated." The room obeyed instantly. "This court is now in session. United States versus Brandon Michael Kellerman. Will the defendant please rise?" At the defense table, Brandon stood, but not with the deference typically shown in a federal courtroom. He stood like a man at a cocktail party, one hand casually in his pocket, his tailored navy suit probably worth more than most people in the room earned in 6 months. His silk tie was perfectly knotted. His expression was one of mild annoyance, as if this whole process was beneath him. His attorney, Martin Schaefer, silver-haired, expensively dressed, and known for his aggressive tactics, stood beside him with a carefully neutral expression. Judge Thomas studied Brandon for a long moment. The silence stretched. "Mr. Kellerman, do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brandon replied, his tone just barely respectful enough to avoid contempt, but dripping with condescension. "And how do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." Brandon's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Completely not guilty." Judge Thomas made a note, his expression unchanged. "You may be seated. Counsel, your opening statements." The prosecution went first. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Park, a sharp young prosecutor who'd built her reputation on holding powerful people accountable. She laid out the case methodically. The video evidence, the witness testimony, the medical reports, the defendant's own words captured on recording. "Ladies and gentlemen," she concluded, "this case is about accountability. It's about whether we are all equal under the law, or whether wealth and family connections can shield someone from consequences. The evidence will show that Brandon Kellerman's actions that day were not a mistake. They were an expression of his belief that he is above the rules that govern everyone else." When she sat down, the courtroom was silent. Martin Schaefer rose with theatrical flair. His opening was predictable. Self-defense, misunderstanding, an unfortunate accident, a good young man under extreme stress, the victim perhaps more fragile than anyone knew. "My client is not a monster," Schaefer said smoothly. "He's a successful young businessman who made a terrible error in judgment during a momentary lapse. He deeply regrets what happened and has immense compassion for Mr. Cho." Brandon nodded solemnly at this, as if he'd rehearsed the gesture. Several veterans in the gallery shook their heads in disgust. The prosecution called its first witness, Margaret Flynn, a 56-year-old teacher who'd been buying gardening supplies and witnessed the entire incident. She described what she'd seen in painful detail. "He didn't just push Mr. Cho, he shoved him with both hands, hard, like he wanted to hurt him. And then he just left. Didn't even check if the man was okay." On cross-examination, Schaefer tried to poke holes in her memory, suggest her view was obstructed, imply she was biased. Margaret didn't budge. "I know what I saw." The second witness was Jamal Davis, a construction worker who'd been the first to call 911. His testimony was equally damning. When the prosecution played the security camera footage on the courtroom monitors, gasps rippled through the gallery. Watching it on a screen was one thing. Seeing it on a large display in a courtroom, the violence stark and undeniable, was another. Henry Cho's body hitting the newspaper stand. The blood pooling beneath his head. Brandon walking away without a backward glance. Judge Thomas watched the screen with no visible reaction, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then it was time for the victim himself. The courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff wheeled Henry Cho to the witness stand. The old man looked smaller than his photos. The assault and surgery had taken their toll. But his spine was straight, and his eyes were clear. The clerk administered the oath. Henry's voice, though thin, was steady. "I do." Prosecutor Park approached gently. "Mr. Cho, thank you for being here today. I know this is difficult. Can you tell the court, in your own words, what happened on the afternoon of August 15th? Henry took a breath. "I was leaving Morrison's Hardware. I bought some light bulbs for my daughter's house. I was getting into my car. It takes me a little while, I have arthritis, when I heard someone honking. Loud, aggressive honking. I tried to move faster, but—" He gestured to his legs. "Fast isn't what it used to be." What happened next? The honking got worse. Then I heard shouting. Cursing. The man— Henry glanced at Brandon— the defendant came up to me as I was closing my car door. He was very angry. He called me names. Told me I shouldn't be allowed to drive. And what did you say? I said, "Young man, patience is a virtue. My mother taught me that. I thought maybe—" Henry's voice cracked slightly. "I thought maybe he'd calm down. But he got angrier. And then he pushed me. That's all I remember before hitting the ground." "What do you remember after that?" "Pain. Terrible pain. People around me. Someone holding my hand. I heard sirens. My wife, Sarah, she passed 3 years ago. I remember thinking about her, wondering if I'd see her again." Several people in the gallery wiped their eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Cho," Prosecutor Park said softly, returning to her seat. Schaefer stood for cross-examination, but even he seemed to sense the danger. He kept it brief, attempting to suggest Henry might have stumbled or lost his balance naturally. Henry's response was quiet but devastating. "Sir, I survived combat in Korea. I know the difference between falling and being attacked." Schaefer sat down quickly. Judge Thomas leaned forward. "Mr. Cho, you are excused. Thank you for your service, both to this country and to this court." Henry nodded, and the bailiff wheeled him out. The next witness was Dr. Samuel Okonkwo, the orthopedic surgeon who'd operated on Henry. His testimony was clinical but damning. The force required to cause the injuries, the permanent disability, the likelihood that Henry would never live independently again. Throughout all of this, Brandon sat at the defense table with barely concealed impatience. He checked his watch twice. He whispered comments to Schaefer that made the attorney shake his head in warning. Once, when Dr. Okonkwo described the shattered hip bone, Brandon actually rolled his eyes. Judge Thomas saw it. So did half the courtroom. When the prosecution rested, it was 4:30 p.m. Judge Thomas called a brief recess before the defense would begin. During the break, Brandon stood and stretched like a man at the gym. He laughed at something Schaefer said. He sipped water from a crystal glass his family had brought him. Regular courthouse cups apparently weren't good enough. The veterans in the gallery stared at him with expressions of pure contempt. When court reconvened, Schaefer called his first defense witness, a psychiatrist who'd evaluated Brandon and testified about stress-induced reactive behavior and impulse control disorders. It was the standard wealthy defendant playbook. He's not bad, he's troubled. He's not criminal, he's sick. Judge Thomas listened without comment, but his expression suggested he'd heard this song before and hadn't believed it then either. The psychiatrist finished. Schaefer called 2 character witnesses, business associates who testified that Brandon was generous, hard-working, and respected in the community. On cross-examination, Prosecutor Park asked each of them, "Were you there on August 15th when Mr. Kellerman assaulted Henry Cho?" "No." "So you can't speak to his character in that moment, can you?" "No." Finally, Schaefer stood. "Your Honor, the defense calls Brandon Kellerman to the stand." This was the moment everyone had waited for. Brandon stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the witness stand with the confidence of someone who'd never truly faced consequences in his life. He was sworn in, sat down, and crossed his legs comfortably. Schaefer led him through a carefully prepared narrative. Stressed from work, didn't sleep well, the traffic that day was terrible, he felt threatened by the situation, he didn't mean to hurt anyone, he's so sorry. Brandon delivered the lines smoothly, but there was something hollow in his voice, something mechanical. He was saying what he'd been told to say, but not a word of it reached his eyes. Then came Prosecutor Park's cross-examination. She stood slowly, picked up a tablet, and approached the witness stand. "Mr. Kellerman, you testified that you felt threatened by Mr. Cho. Is that correct?" "Yes." Henry Cho is 73 years old, uses a cane, and weighs approximately 140 pounds. You're 28, 6 feet tall, and according to your gym membership records, you work out 5 days a week. What exactly about Mr. Cho threatened you? Brandon's jaw tightened. It wasn't physical. It was the situation. The situation where an elderly man was taking too long to get into his car? He was blocking me. Blocking you from a parking space? Yes. Were there other parking spaces available? Brandon hesitated. I don't remember. Security footage shows 17 empty spaces within 50 feet of where this occurred. But you needed that specific space. I was already there. You were already honking and screaming profanity at a senior citizen? I was frustrated. So frustrated that you assaulted a decorated war veteran? Schaefer shot to his feet. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Thomas said calmly. Rephrase, Counselor. Prosecutor Park nodded. Mr. Kellerman, after you pushed Mr. Cho, after you saw him lying on the ground bleeding, what did you do? I left. You left the scene? Yes. Did you call 911? No. Did you check if he was breathing? No. Did you ask anyone to help him? No. What did you do? Brandon's arrogance began cracking. I drove away. And what did you do then? Did you turn yourself in to police? No. I called my attorney. Not your father, the police commissioner? Brandon's face flushed. Eventually. Mr. Kellerman, you said you're sorry for what happened. When did you become sorry? When you saw Mr. Cho on the ground? When you watched the news that night? When you were charged with a federal crime? Or are you sorry that you got caught? Objection. Schaefer shouted. Withdrawn, Prosecutor Park said smoothly. No further questions. Brandon returned to his seat, his composure visibly shaken. The mask had slipped. The defense rested. Closing arguments were scheduled for the next morning, but Judge Thomas had seen enough. Before we adjourn, he said, his voice like iron, I want to address something. Mr. Kellerman, I've presided over hundreds of cases in my career. I've seen genuine remorse, and I've seen performance. What I witnessed today was the latter." Brandon's face went white. "You sat in this courtroom with barely concealed contempt for this process, for the victim, for the very concept of accountability. You checked your watch during testimony about a man's shattered bones. You rolled your eyes when a doctor described permanent disability. You thought this was a minor inconvenience, didn't you?" Brandon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "This court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. for closing arguments and sentencing deliberation. Until then, you are remanded to custody. No bail." "Your Honor!" Schaefer jumped up. "My client has appeared at every—" "Your client has shown this court that he believes himself above consequences, Mr. Schaefer. That ends today. Bailiff, take Mr. Kellerman into custody." The courtroom erupted. Brandon's face went from white to red as the bailiff approached with handcuffs. For the first time, genuine fear flashed in his eyes. "This is insane!" Brandon shouted, his polished mask finally shattering completely. "You can't do this! Do you know who my father is?" One phone call and Judge Thomas's gavel came down like a gunshot. "One more word, Mr. Kellerman, and I'll hold you in contempt. Your father's position is irrelevant in this courtroom. I suggest you spend tonight reflecting on what real accountability looks like." The bailiff cuffed Brandon's wrists behind his back. As he was led toward the side door, he twisted back toward the gallery, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. Dad, do something." The entire courtroom turned to look where Brandon was staring. And that's when people saw him. In the very back row, partially hidden behind a stone pillar, sat Police Commissioner Robert Kellerman. He'd been there the entire time. His face was drawn, aged beyond his years. His uniform, usually worn with pride, seemed to weigh on him like armor made of shame. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from exhaustion or tears no one could tell. He'd watched his son lie on the stand. He'd watched his son show contempt for justice. He'd watched his son prove every terrible thing Robert had feared was true. And now, every eye in the courtroom was on him. Judge Thomas stood slowly. The room fell into absolute silence. "Commissioner Kellerman," the judge said quietly but firmly, "I believe you have something to say to this court." Robert Kellerman remained seated for a long moment, his hands gripping the bench in front of him until his knuckles went white. And then someone stood up in the back of the courtroom. Commissioner Robert Kellerman rose to his feet slowly, like a man carrying a weight that had been crushing him for years. He was 58 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, with the broad shoulders and ramrod posture of someone who'd spent 37 years in law enforcement. His uniform was decorated with commendations, medals for valor, for service, for leadership. The 4 stars on his shoulders marked him as the highest-ranking police official in the state. But in that moment, standing in the back of the courtroom with every eye upon him, he looked like nothing more than a broken father. "Permission to approach, Your Honor," he said, his deep voice hoarse. Judge Thomas studied him for a long, measured moment. "Granted." Robert walked down the center aisle. His footsteps echoed in the absolute silence. Veterans turned to watch him pass. Reporters held their breath. Even Brandon, still held by the bailiff near the side door, stood frozen, staring at his father with an expression somewhere between hope and dread. Robert reached the front of the courtroom and stopped at the bar that separated the gallery from the court proper. "Your Honor," he began, then stopped, his voice catching. He cleared his throat and started again. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I need to say something to this court." "To you, too." He glanced at Henry Cho, seated in his wheelchair in the front row. "To Mr. Cho. And to my son." Judge Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Proceed, Commissioner." Robert took a breath that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "I've been sitting in the back of this courtroom since the trial began. I told my staff I was working from home. I told my wife I was dealing with department business. The truth is, I couldn't bring myself to sit up front and watch what I already knew I'd see." His voice grew stronger, clearer. "I've known for a long time that my son had a problem. Not with impulse control or stress management or any of those clinical terms his expensive psychiatrist used. Brandon's problem is simpler than that. He doesn't believe the rules apply to him." Brandon's face flushed red. "Dad." "Be silent, Mr. Kellerman," Judge Thomas said coldly, not even looking at Brandon. "Your father has the floor." Robert continued, his jaw set. "And that's my fault. Mine and my wife's. We gave him everything he wanted. We shielded him from consequences. When he crashed his car drunk at 19, I made it disappear. When he got into fights at college, I made calls. When he cheated on his business exams, we donated to the university. Every time, we told ourselves we were protecting him, helping him, giving him chances." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "What we were actually doing was creating a monster." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "I watched the video of what he did to Mr. Cho 50 times. 50 times I watched my son, my own flesh and blood, assault an elderly man over a parking space. And every time, I told myself there had to be more to the story. There had to be some explanation. Because how could the boy I raised, the son I loved, do something like that?" Robert turned slowly to face Brandon directly. His son's eyes were wide, glistening. "But there isn't more to the story, is there, Brandon? You did it because you were inconvenienced. You did it because you thought you could. You did it because 30 years of your mother and me letting you off the hook taught you that there are no real consequences for Brandon Kellerman." "Dad, please." Brandon's voice was barely a whisper. Robert turned back to Judge Thomas. "Your Honor, I know what I'm about to say is unusual, but I need to say it. My family, my father, my grandfather, we've served the law in this state for 80 years. 3 generations of police officers. My grandfather used to tell me, the badge doesn't make you above the law, Robert. It makes you a servant to it." He reached up and unpinned the police commissioner's badge from his uniform. The metal gleamed under the courtroom lights, the seal of the state, the symbol of authority he'd worn with pride for nearly 4 decades. "I need to honor that service now. I need to honor the oath I took when I first became a police officer, to uphold the law equally, without favor or prejudice." He placed the badge on the bar. "So I'm here to tell you, Your Honor, that I will not interfere in this case. I will not make calls. I will not use my position to protect my son from the consequences of his actions." The courtroom exploded in whispers. Judge Thomas's gavel came down once. "Order." Silence returned immediately. Robert wasn't finished. "More than that, Your Honor, I'm asking you to do your duty without consideration for who his father is. Brandon committed a crime. A serious, violent crime against a man who served this country with honor and has spent his life serving his community. My son showed no remorse, no understanding, no basic human decency. And he won't learn those things if he's shielded from consequences again." Tears were streaming down Robert's face now, but his voice never wavered. "As a father, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. But as a man who's worn a badge for 37 years, it's the only thing I can do. The law has to mean something. Justice has to mean something. And if my son doesn't learn that now, he never will." He turned again to look at Brandon, who was openly weeping now, the bailiff's hand still firm on his arm. "I love you, son. I will always love you. But I won't protect you from this. Not any more." Then Robert turned to Henry Cho. The old veteran sat motionless in his wheelchair, his weathered face unreadable. "Mr. Cho," Robert said, his voice breaking, I am so deeply sorry. Sorry for what my son did to you. Sorry for the pain he caused you. Sorry for every day of your life that's been harder because of him. I can't undo what he did. But I promise you, I promise this court, that he will be held accountable. Fully and completely. Henry Cho was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded once. It was the smallest gesture, but it carried enormous weight. Robert picked up his badge from the bar, looked at it one last time, and then placed it back down. Your Honor, when this trial is over, I'll be submitting my resignation as police commissioner, effective immediately. I can't continue to serve when I failed so fundamentally in my own home. But before I go, I needed to stand here and do the right thing. Maybe for the first time in a long time. He started to turn away, then stopped. One more thing, Your Honor. Whatever sentence you impose, I'd like your permission to add one condition. After Brandon serves his time, I'd like him to spend 1 year working in the Veterans Affairs Office, helping elderly veterans with their claims, their medical appointments, their daily needs. Not for credit. Not for show. To learn what service actually means. Judge Thomas regarded him with an expression that was impossible to read. Surprise, respect, sadness, approval, all mixed together. Commissioner Kellerman, the judge said quietly, you've demonstrated more courage in the last 5 minutes than most people show in a lifetime. This court thanks you for your honesty and your integrity. Robert nodded stiffly, the way a military man acknowledges a superior officer, then turned and walked back up the aisle. As he passed his son, still held by the bailiff, tears streaming down his face, his expensive suit rumpled, his arrogance finally and completely shattered, Robert stopped. Father and son locked eyes. I love you, Robert said again. And that's why I'm doing this. Then he walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. Brandon sagged in the bailiff's grip, his legs barely holding him. All the arrogance, all the entitlement, all the smirking confidence, gone. In its place was something raw and broken and, perhaps for the first time in his life, genuinely afraid. Judge Thomas let the silence stretch for nearly a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Mr. Kellerman, you have just witnessed something I wish more defendants could see, a parent who loves their child enough to let them face consequences. Your father just gave you the greatest gift a father can give, the gift of accountability, even when it breaks his heart to do so. Brandon couldn't even look up. This court stands in recess until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., at which time I will deliver the sentence. Mr. Kellerman, you will spend tonight in federal custody. Use that time to think about what you heard today. Bailiff, remove the defendant. As Brandon was led away, still crying, the courtroom remained eerily quiet. People didn't move. No one spoke. They just witnessed something profound, something that transcended the usual theatrical drama of trials. They'd witnessed a father choose justice over love. Or perhaps, choose love so deeply that he chose justice. Henry Cho sat in his wheelchair, his daughter's hand on his shoulder, tears in his eyes that weren't about pain anymore. Prosecutor Jennifer Park closed her files, but her hands were shaking. Even the reporters, usually so quick to rush for the exits and file their stories, sat frozen, processing what they'd just seen. Judge Thomas gathered his papers, stood, and paused before leaving the bench. What Commissioner Kellerman did today, he said to the silent courtroom, is what real honor looks like. This court is adjourned. He exited to his chambers, leaving behind a courtroom full of people who'd just seen something they'd never forget. Outside, Robert Kellerman sat in his car in the courthouse parking lot, his head in his hands, and wept for the son he loved and the man that son needed to become. Inside the federal holding cell, Brandon Kellerman sat on a metal bench, still wearing his expensive suit, staring at the concrete wall and finally, beginning to understand what he'd done. Tomorrow, justice would be served. But tonight, the harder work had already begun, the work of transformation. The courtroom the next morning was somehow even more packed than the day before. Word had spread about Commissioner Kellerman's testimony, and the story had exploded across every news network, social media platform, and front page in the country. Police Commissioner refuses to protect son, read one headline. A father's courage, read another. The video of Robert's testimony had been viewed 40 million times overnight. But the people in courtroom 6B weren't there for spectacle. They were there to bear witness to something increasingly rare in modern America: accountability. At 8:55 a.m., the bailiffs brought Brandon Kellerman in. He wore an orange jumpsuit now, his expensive suits and silk ties replaced by the standard uniform of the detained. His hair, usually perfectly styled, was disheveled. His face was pale and drawn. His eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night. But something had changed. The arrogance was gone. The smirk had vanished. When he entered, he kept his eyes down, no longer making eye contact with anyone. At 9 a.m. sharp, Judge Thomas entered. Everyone rose. "Be seated," he commanded, and took his place at the bench. He looked first at Brandon, studying him for a long moment, then surveyed the courtroom. When he spoke, his voice was measured but carried unmistakable weight. "This court has considered all testimony, all evidence, and all arguments presented in this case. Mr. Kellerman, please rise." Brandon stood, his legs visibly unsteady. His attorney, Martin Schaefer, stood beside him. "Brandon Michael Kellerman," Judge Thomas began, "you have been found guilty of aggravated assault, assault on an elderly person, and reckless endangerment. Before I pronounce sentence, I want to explain my reasoning, because what happens in this courtroom today is about more than punishment. It's about whether our justice system means what it says, that all people are equal under the law." He paused, letting the words settle. "You are 28 years old. You were raised in privilege. You attended the best schools, had every advantage, every opportunity. And yet, when faced with a minor inconvenience, an elderly man taking too long in a parking space, you responded with violence. Not just violence, but violence against a decorated war veteran, a man who has given more to this country and his community than you've given in your entire life." Brandon's shoulders began to shake. What makes this particularly troubling is not just the assault itself, but everything that came after. You didn't help Mr. Cho. You didn't call for medical assistance. You didn't wait for police. You simply left. And in the days that followed, you showed no genuine remorse. You hired expensive lawyers to minimize your actions. You sat in this courtroom with contempt for the process and the victim. Judge Thomas leaned forward. "But yesterday, something changed. Your father, a man who has dedicated his entire life to law enforcement, stood in this courtroom and did something extraordinary. He chose justice over protection. He chose the law over family loyalty. He demonstrated more character in 5 minutes than many people show in a lifetime." He paused again. "The question now is whether you can demonstrate even a fraction of that character. Whether you can take responsibility, truly and fully, for what you've done. And whether you can transform yourself from the entitled young man who assaulted Henry Cho into someone who understands what service, humility, and accountability actually mean." Judge Thomas opened the file before him. "The sentencing guidelines for your crimes, given the aggravating factors, would allow for a sentence of up to 8 years in federal prison. The prosecution has recommended 6 years. Your defense has requested probation and community service." The courtroom held its collective breath. "After careful consideration, here is the sentence of this court. You will serve 4 years in federal prison, with no possibility of early release or parole. This is not negotiable. You will serve every day of that sentence." Brandon swayed slightly but remained standing. "After your release from prison, you will be on supervised probation for 3 years. During that probation, you will be prohibited from holding any executive position in any company. You will not manage other people until you've learned to manage yourself. The judge continued, his voice growing firmer. Additionally, you will complete 2,000 hours of community service at veterans' facilities. Not at charity galas where you can network and rebuild your image. At actual VA hospitals, veterans' homes, and service organizations, doing actual physical work, cleaning, serving meals, assisting with daily care. You will learn what service looks like. He looked directly at Brandon. Your father suggested you spend a year working in the Veterans Affairs Office after your sentence. This court accepts that recommendation. For 1 full year following your probation, you will work full-time, 40 hours per week, minimum wage, helping elderly veterans. Mr. Cho's attorney has helped arrange this. You will report directly to the VA supervisor, and any failure to meet expectations will result in additional prison time. Prosecutor Park's lips curved into the smallest smile. Defense attorney Schaefer closed his eyes, knowing this could have been much worse. Finally, Judge Thomas said, you will pay full restitution to Henry Cho for all medical expenses, lost income from his diner, and pain and suffering. The amount, calculated by the court, is $437,000. You will also establish a $100,000 scholarship fund in Mr. Cho's name for veterans' children pursuing higher education. The numbers made Brandon flinch, but he nodded slightly. Do you have anything to say before this sentence is finalized? For the first time since entering, Brandon looked up. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it carried in the silent courtroom. Your Honor, Mr. Cho. He stopped, tears spilling down his face. I don't have words that can fix what I did. I can't undo it. I can't make Mr. Cho's hip heal or give him back his diner or erase the pain I caused. He wiped his eyes with his shackled hands. My whole life, I thought I was special. I thought the rules didn't apply to me because of who my family was, because of our money, because I'd never really faced consequences before. And when my dad stood up yesterday and said he wouldn't protect me, I was angry. I was terrified. But when I sat in that cell last night, I realized he gave me something I didn't even know I needed. Brandon's voice broke. He gave me the truth. And the truth is I'm not special. I'm not above the law. And what I did to Mr. Cho was inexcusable, unforgivable, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. He turned toward Henry Cho, who sat in his wheelchair in the front row, his daughter beside him. Mr. Cho, I know you have no reason to forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me. But I want you to know that I will spend every day of my sentence and every day after trying to become someone who deserves to share this world with people like you. People who've actually served, actually sacrificed, actually contributed something meaningful. Henry Cho's expression remained unreadable. Brandon turned back to Judge Thomas. I accept your sentence, Your Honor. All of it. And I'll do everything you've ordered, not because I have to, but because it's what I should do. What I should have done from the beginning. Judge Thomas studied him for a long moment. Mr. Kellerman, only time will tell if those words are genuine. But I hope they are. Because you have a long road ahead, and the man you are on the other side of it will depend entirely on the choices you make starting today. He raised his gavel. This court sentence is hereby entered into the record. Marshal, please take Mr. Kellerman into custody for immediate transfer to federal detention. The gavel came down with finality. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped forward. Brandon didn't resist. As they began to lead him away, he stopped and looked once more at his father, who had entered quietly and taken a seat in the back row again, this time in plain clothes. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Robert's face was drawn with pain, but also something else, a quiet pride, perhaps, in seeing his son finally take responsibility. Brandon mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Robert nodded once, tears streaming down his face, and placed his hand over his heart. Then Brandon was led away through the side door, beginning his journey toward either redemption or ruin. Only he could determine which. A voice from the victim. Before the courtroom could empty, Henry Cho raised his hand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "may I say something?" Judge Thomas, who had been gathering his papers, looked up in surprise. "Of course, Mr. Cho. Please." Henry's daughter wheeled him forward slightly so everyone could hear. "I am 73 years old," Henry began. "I have lived through war, poverty, discrimination, loss, and now this. I have seen the worst that people can do. But I've also seen the best." He paused, looking around the courtroom. "What happened to me was wrong. What that young man did was cruel and senseless. And I will carry the consequences, this wheelchair, this pain, for the rest of my life." Several people in the gallery wiped their eyes. "But yesterday, I watched a father make an impossible choice. I watched Commissioner Kellerman put justice above his own son. And I realized something. We are not defined by our worst moments. We are defined by whether we can rise above them." Henry looked toward the door where Brandon had been led out. "I don't know if Brandon Kellerman will change. I don't know if 4 years in prison will transform him or if he'll serve his time and go back to being who he was. But I know this. His father gave him a chance to find out. And Judge Thomas gave him a path to walk." He turned to face the judge directly. "Your Honor, I agree with your sentence. Every part of it. Not because I want revenge, but because I believe in redemption. And redemption requires accountability first." Henry's voice grew stronger. "I spent 3 years in Korea watching young men, boys, really, faced with impossible choices. Some rose to the occasion. Some didn't. But the ones who survived, who came home and built good lives, were the ones who learned that true strength isn't about power or money or position. It's about character." He glanced at Robert Kellerman in the back row. "Commissioner, what you did yesterday took more courage than anything I saw in combat. You taught your son something no amount of privilege could teach him, that love sometimes means letting someone fall so they can learn to stand on their own." Robert could barely speak. "Thank you," he managed. Henry turned back to the courtroom at large. "I don't know what happens next. But I know this. If Brandon Kellerman becomes the man he can be, if he uses this experience to grow and serve and contribute, then maybe something good can come from something terrible. Maybe my broken hip and his broken pride can become something more than just tragedy." He placed his weathered hands on the arms of his wheelchair. "That's all I wanted to say. I forgive Brandon Kellerman. Not because he deserves it, not yet. But because forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing not to carry hate. I've carried enough in my life. I won't carry that." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Judge Thomas stood, and this time there was visible emotion on his normally stern face. "Mr. Cho, in 30 years on the bench, I have never heard anything quite like what you just said. You have honored this court, and you have honored yourself." "Thank you." Henry nodded simply, and his daughter wheeled him toward the exit. As they passed Commissioner Kellerman, Henry reached out his hand. Robert grasped it, and the two men held that connection for a long moment. A veteran and a cop, both men of service, both wounded by the same person in different ways. No words were needed.